While millions fought with rifles, others advanced with shovels, explosives, and mine detectors. They were World 2 engineers, the ones who built and destroyed without mercy. But what did it really mean to be the first crawling through deadly minefields, building bridges under enemy fire? Discover how these silent heroes literally decided the bloodiest conflict in history today, with tools that could save or kill in seconds. During World War II, millions of soldiers faced incredible challenges. But not all of them attacked with rifles on the front lines. Many carried shovels, explosives, and mine detectors. They were called engineers, and their job was to build and destroy, open paths for their own units, and set traps for the enemy. In just a moment, we'll discover how essential these men were and what unique skills they had to master to help decide the biggest conflict in history. In this video, you'll learn what it was like to be an engineer during World War II, what their daily service looked like, what dangers they faced on the battlefield, and what crucial role they played in battles from Europe to the Pacific. Soon we'll find out together everything a soldier engineer had to go through, from tough training to real action under fire. I'd really appreciate if you support this video with a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Engineers, also known as sappers, pioneers, or military engineers, were specially trained soldiers whose main mission was to help the army overcome obstacles while creating obstacles for the enemy. From the beginning of modern warfare, it was clear that besides infantry and tank crews, experts were also needed who could build bridges, dig trenches, disable explosives, and build defensive positions. In World War II, with its enormous troop mobility and destructive weapon power, this need multiplied. Engineer units existed in the armies of all major fighting sides. For example, in the British Army, engineers proudly carried the title Royal Engineers and were traditionally nicknamed sappers. In the German Wehrmacht, they were pioneers who accompanied attacking units in lightning campaigns. In the Red Army of the Soviet Union, engineer battalions and brigades operated called sappers, whose deployment ranged from building defensive lines to laying minefields. Even in Pacific battlefields, Americans relied on special naval engineers called Seabees, who built harbors and airfields on captured islands. Although they differed in uniform and language, all these engineers shared the same fate: hard, dangerous, and often underappreciated work in the rear and directly under enemy fire. Why were engineers so essential? Let's imagine an advancing army. In its path stands a river without a bridge, a zone of dangerous mines, barricades of barbed wire, and anti-tank obstacles. Regular infantry or tanks can't handle such obstacles, and that's when engineers come into play. Their motto could be, "We always find a way." These soldiers were trained to enable movement of their own forces called mobility, and conversely slow down enemy movement called counter-mobility. Besides that, they also ensured survival of other units called survivability. They built fortifications, shelters, and camouflage that protected fellow soldiers from enemy fire. In this video, you'll learn specific examples of these tasks, from building bridges under fire to disabling timed bombs in city ruins. Main engineer tasks in a nutshell: mobility, making movement easier for their own army; building temporary bridges over rivers and ditches; repairing and building roads; removing debris and obstacles; clearing mines from paths and passages through minefields; counter-mobility, slowing down the enemy; laying minefields and traps; building anti-tank obstacles like ditches, hedgehogs, and barricades; demolishing bridges, roads, and railways during retreat so the enemy couldn't move quickly; survivability and support, protection and logistics; building fortifications, trenches, bunkers, and firing positions; constructing shelters and field hospitals; securing supply routes in the front; building small bridges for supplies; providing water and electricity in field conditions; camouflaging units and equipment; and even disposing of unexploded ammunition in liberated areas. As you can see, engineers had to be universal specialists. They combined physical strength, technical knowledge, and courage. They weren't engineers with college degrees in offices, but ordinary soldiers with extraordinary training. Their daily bread: 1 hour digging, another cutting beams, then maybe dragging pontoons, and finally crawling with mine detectors along ridges in front of enemy lines. In a moment, we'll see how demanding training and equipment prepared engineers for these versatile tasks. Engineers went through one of the toughest training programs imaginable. They had to learn to handle explosives, lay and remove mines, build bridges, and cross water barriers, while also mastering regular infantry combat if things got really bad. Engineer soldiers typically completed basic infantry training, followed by a specialized course at engineer school. For example, a young Brit or American might find himself at a training camp where, from morning to evening, he practiced building pontoon bridges. He learned to calculate the needed amount of explosive to blow up a tree or bunker and repeatedly practiced procedures for crossing minefields. As remembered in memoirs of American engineers, first they put a shovel in our hands and taught us to dig trenches, then they gave us rifles so we could defend ourselves. And finally, they put dynamite in our hands with the words, "Now your engineers learn to work with this quickly." Training often happened through practical tests. Recruits had to build improvised bridges from available logs and planks themselves, or under supervision of experienced instructors, they set off practice charges. There was also tough drilling and mine clearing, practice minefields with dummy mines, but sometimes real ones too, where sappers crawled with bayonets and learned to sense underground danger. A similar scene is known from the Normandy landing. Soldiers there used so-called Bangalore torpedoes, long tubular charges that they pushed under barbed wire and detonated to create passages. Engineers had to be thoroughly familiar with this procedure already in the rear. Working with explosives and charges was absolutely crucial. A World War II engineer had various types of explosives available, from classic TNT explosive in the form of cartridges and plastic explosive to specialized shaped charges designed to penetrate armor or concrete. He had to be able to calculate, often by eye from experience, how much explosive was needed to, for example, bring down a steel bridge or blow up a concrete bunker. According to veterans, instructors often emphasized, "The enemy might destroy our bridges, but we can build them again, and we know how to destroy theirs whenever necessary." For these purposes, engineers got special igniters, detonators, blasting caps, and miles of detonating cord in their hands. They learned patience when lighting slow fuses and quick work when setting blasting caps, because time was often a luxury they didn't have in battle. Besides explosives, engineer equipment included countless tools: pickaxes, shovels, axes, saws, all necessary for digging trenches and cutting down trees. Also wrenches, pliers, and welding kits for repairing structures or cutting metals. Many engineers were skilled craftsmen in civilian life, which came in handy. Maps and sketches were essential. Engineers often worked according to plans or created them themselves and had to navigate both terrain and paperwork. A special chapter was mine detectors, portable devices like the famous American mine detector SCR-6225, which beeped if it detected metal underground. Engineers learned to use them, but soon discovered the enemy could adapt. For example, Germans began making mines from wood and glass that didn't react to detectors. Training therefore included old-fashioned methods too, searching for mines with bayonets or probes, slow crawling and gentle stabbing into the ground ahead centimeter by centimeter. An engineer also had to be a soldier and fighter. Training included practice shooting handheld weapons, throwing grenades in close combat, because at the front it could happen any time that an engineer unit would be drawn into direct battle. For example, German pioneers were also trained in assault techniques, got flamethrowers or so-called assault pistols for firing grenades, and practiced man-to-man combat so they could eliminate enemy bunkers. Soviet sappers got tough physical endurance drilling. Soviet regulations supposedly required an engineer to work 12 hours daily on fortification construction and spend another 2 hours on military training. In reality, many Soviet engineers at the front worked 14 hours a day, often in frost or mud, with minimal rest. The result of such demanding preparation were soldiers who could handle almost any obstacle. Once training ended, real deployment awaited them, and only then did it show how valuable all those learned skills were. In a moment, we'll learn from specific frontline stories how engineers built and destroyed. With one hand, they built bridges for their comrades. With the other, they blew up enemy bridges. The wartime fate of an engineer depended on the situation. Sometimes he advanced with the army in attack. Other times he had to defend captured territory and place obstacles for the enemy. Let's first look at this defensive side of engineer work. What it meant to be an engineer in situations when it was necessary to dig in and defend positions or prepare retreat and delay pursuing enemy. During World War II, enormous defensive systems were built and thousands of engineers participated in each one. For example, the Maginot Line in France, a system of bunkers and obstacles on borders, or the German West Wall were largely the work of engineer units even before fighting broke out. However, when Germans launched their lightning invasion of France in 1940, they simply bypassed the Maginot Line and showed that static fortifications had weaknesses too. But this didn't mean engineer work became useless. On the contrary, during retreat battles, engineers destroyed roads and bridges to slow down attacking tank units. Let's imagine a retreating army situation. The enemy is pushing forward and it's necessary to delay their advance so own units can regroup. Engineers at such a moment got orders: destroy everything that could help the enemy advance. And so they blew up bridges, destroyed railway tracks, and laid mines on roads. Retreating Soviet forces in 1941, for example, blew up entire factories and supplies so nothing would fall into German hands. These sabotage actions were often directed by Army engineers and NKVD specialists. In this context, the infamous case of the Dnieper Dam in August 1941 is notorious. Soviet engineers mined the giant dam of the hydroelectric plant near Zaporizhzhia, and on Stalin's order detonated it when Germans approached. The giant flood swept away not only advancing enemies, but unfortunately also thousands of civilians and Red Army soldiers who didn't escape in time. A tragic reminder of how destructive engineer work could be. On the Western Front in 1944, Germans were retreating for a change and left devastation behind them. For example, during retreat from southern Italy, Germans systematically destroyed every bridge and every road. According to period reports, American engineers in Calabria and Campania had to build 25 temporary bridges in just 25 kilometers of advance because all original bridges were destroyed by retreating units. Imagine that effort. A new bridge every day, often under fire from enemy artillery trying to slow down repairs. Military records show that at the Italian town of Acerno, the American Army had to deploy an entire infantry regiment just to clear the opposite bank of deep ravines from German machine gunners who were firing at the place where engineers needed to build a bridge. And even when the enemy was driven away, artillery observers often secretly watched repaired crossings and directed fire at every new bridge that appeared. For engineers, this meant only one thing: work as quickly as possible, often at night, and immediately after completing construction, take cover from artillery salvos. Many soldiers later remembered that the terror of frontal machine gun attack was eventually replaced by a different fear. Fear of the silent click of a mine under their boot or an explosion that comes without warning during routine work. Engineers were also masters of building field fortifications. When the front stopped or the army went on defense, their big moment came. Shovels and pickaxes played a concert. In a short time, they could conjure complex defensive works from the ground. Systems of trenches woven with barbed wire, minefields, anti-tank ditches, bunkers built from sandbags. On the Eastern Front in winter 1941-42, such abilities were one of the factors that helped stop German advance at Moscow. Tens of thousands of civilians joined in, but the heart of organization was Red Army engineers. Soviet sappers built 3 belts of fortifications around Moscow. Anti-tank ditches hundreds of kilometers long, reinforced concrete firing bunkers, and wooden blockhouses hidden in forests. According to Soviet General Staff reports from January 1942, it was thanks to engineers that defensive lines were created that significantly contributed to stopping the enemy before Moscow. Historian David Glantz states that engineer units significantly contributed to victories at Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad. They built defensive positions there and thus enabled Soviets to repel German attacks. Engineers in defense didn't just build, but also fought using their traps. Defensive minefields they laid could destroy enemy tanks or break up infantry formations. For example, German jumping mines S-mine, nicknamed shrapnel mines or by Allies bouncing Bettys, flew up to waist height when stepped on and exploded, showering the area with fragments. These devilish weapons were laid in large numbers by German engineers around their positions, which slowed and demoralized attacking units. An Allied soldier who stepped on such a mine had only fractions of a second to throw himself to the ground, often in vain. Allied engineers distinguished themselves, for example, in fighting aircraft. In England in 1941, Royal Engineers helped build dummy airfields with fake searchlights and plywood planes to confuse German bombers. This too was part of engineering work in defense, though somewhat in the background. Finally, engineers became experts in improvisation. When standard materials ran out, they had to use what was at hand. Records from the Eastern Front contain stories of how Soviet engineers used frozen ground in the cruel winter of 1943. They poured water around their positions, which immediately froze and created natural ice rinks, preventing German tanks from passing. Or how they booby-trapped seemingly abandoned barrels or boxes on roads during retreat, which they then detonated remotely when enemy columns passed by. Every engineer simply knew that in defense he should be cunning as a fox. The more traps he prepared for the enemy, the more lives he saved for his comrades. The defensive tasks of engineers often depended on the lives of entire units. Many times it was true that what an engineer didn't manage to prepare couldn't be fixed later. For example, if not enough mines were laid, an enemy tank attack could easily pass through. Therefore, these soldiers were under great pressure from superiors in time. And while all fellow soldiers welcomed the possibility of rest in the rear, engineers worked even in the back, digging, building, repairing, camouflaging. It's ironic that the better they did their job, the less others noticed. When an obstacle stopped the enemy, it looked natural. When nothing happened, hardly anyone thanked them, but one failure was enough, and questions immediately followed. Why isn't that bridge destroyed? Why didn't we have better shelters? Engineers had to live with this awareness too, but defensive work was only half the story. Now let's look at what awaited engineers in attack, because that's where their most dangerous moments often came, when they had to go first ahead of other soldiers into places full of mines, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. In a moment, we'll learn how engineers blazed trails for attacking units through seemingly impenetrable obstacles. When offensive time came, engineers literally became trailblazers, the first to head toward enemy obstacles to remove them and enable main forces to advance. Commanders knew well that an attack would be as fast as engineers could clear the path. Therefore, engineer units were often assigned directly to assault waves and had specially prepared tasks in advance. One of the most dramatic displays of engineers in attack came during the Normandy landing on June 6, 1944. The beaches where Allies landed were literally scattered with obstacles. Wooden stakes with mines, iron hedgehogs, anti-personnel spikes, and of course a dense network of barbed wire at beach exits. All this was prepared by German pioneers as part of the infamous Atlantic Wall. When dawn broke, landing craft sailed into the waves, and among the first to jump from them into the water were engineers from assault teams. For example, on Omaha Beach, small engineer teams rushed toward obstacles with bags of explosives. Their task was to blow up passages through anti-tank barriers before the tide rose and submerged the explosives. Many paid with their lives. German fire was fierce, and most engineer teams fell or were wounded before they could place charges. Still, they managed to open several key passages. Similarly, on Sword Beach, British engineers deployed special armored vehicles called Hobart's Funnies. For example, tanks with giant rotating cylinders with chains that beat the ground and prematurely detonated mines, called flail tanks or mine beaters. These curious machines operated by engineers cleared strips of beach from mines and allowed infantry to pass more safely. According to eyewitnesses, the scene on beaches was chaotic. Sand, smoke, explosions, and in the middle of it, small groups of engineers who removed charges from obstacles and waved flags or hands from distance. To guide tanks to created gaps. Advance inland meant further challenges for engineers. Minefields, every attacker's nightmare, had to be explored and neutralized as quickly as possible. In practice, this often happened so that before dawn or early morning, a reconnaissance engineer team headed forward. It usually consisted of 5 to 6 men. One carried a mine detector and slowly swept the terrain with it. The second behind him marked found mines with white tape and marked a safe path. The third carried stakes with rope and marked the center of the passage. 2 others watched the surroundings with weapons ready to cover retreat or repel enemy guards. Soviet engineers crawled forward like this before the Battle of Kursk in 1943, when a giant German attack was expected. Sappers went out at night ahead of their own lines, where Germans had laid thousands of mines and tried to open passages through tank minefields. They had only ordinary probes in their hands. Detectors weren't always available. The work was extremely dangerous. A moment of inattention or a wire stretched to a hidden mine was enough, and an explosion sounded. Still, they managed to remove many mines, though at the cost of casualties. From many war diaries, we learn about engineer heroism in mine clearing under fire. One American officer remembered a situation report that came during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. Our attack column stopped. Ahead of us is a dense minefield. It's snowing and enemy machine guns cover the approach. 2 engineers volunteer to crawl forward. Despite bullets cutting into snow around them, both men patiently clear a path. It took them forever, but they did it. Thanks to them, others could pass through. There are dozens of similar stories. Engineers were often unarmed or only lightly armed. When clearing mines, they couldn't afford to be burdened with rifle. They were covered by snipers or machine guns from their units. But still, it depended mainly on their nerves and concentration. When asked later what it was like, many just shrugged. We did our job and prayed we wouldn't step wrong. Overcoming water barriers, rivers, canals, and swamps was another big challenge of attack. It's known that General Patton's rapid advance through France in summer 1944 wouldn't have been possible without engineers who tirelessly built temporary bridges ahead of his tanks. These temporary bridges were often prefabricated steel structures, for example, the famous Bailey bridges developed by the British. Something like a big construction set that engineers assembled in a few hours using cranes and manual work, and the resulting bridge could carry even heavy tanks. On the Moselle River and other obstacles in Lorraine, American engineers even worked under enemy fire so intensively that some collapsed from exhaustion, as described in letters by Sergeant Frank Lambeau, an engineer from Patton's Third Army. He describes how pontoon units transported bridge parts on boats right under the enemy's nose. Several engineers were shot by German snipers, others drowned when explosions swept them into water. But the result was worth it. Hundreds of vehicles and soldiers then rolled across the river and could continue the attack. Sometimes engineers had to be very creative. For example, in the Pacific on Iwo Jima Island in 1945, American Marines desperately needed to get the Japanese airfield working so their planes could land there. But the island was still full of resistance. So Seabees naval engineers went into action with bulldozers and cranes, repairing the runway under fire while battles raged a few hundred meters away. Some of these brave workers in uniform fell to sniper fire. Others continued even with wounds. However, they managed to get the airfield into provisional operation within a few days, and wounded B-29 pilots who would otherwise have fallen into the sea could make emergency landings there. Such acts may not seem as heroic as disabling a tank, but for saved lives, they were worth gold. Another chapter was engineers in urban combat. In city ruins like Stalingrad or Berlin, every house played the role of a fortress. Assault engineer units, often armed with flamethrowers and explosives, had the task of eliminating resistance house by house. For example, German assault pioneers in Stalingrad advanced through sewers and basements, flooded shelters with gasoline and ignited them with flamethrowers, or placed charges bundled from dozens of grenades in basements to blow up entire houses. Similarly, Soviet engineer units at war's end in Berlin fought their way through street barricades. Often it was about breaking through house walls so soldiers could get inside from the side and bypass mined entrances. Engineers were literally human battering rams. They broke passages through walls using explosives and hammers. They tore down barricades with hooks and ropes tied to tanks. They detonated charges in sewers to destroy underground passages. In all this lay their role in attack, preparing a safer path forward for other soldiers. Deployment in attack often brought engineers quick promotions, but unfortunately also quick death. Commanders valued brave specialists and didn't hesitate to decorate them for bravery. We already mentioned the example from Italy where 2 soldiers from the U.S. 45th Infantry Division received medals of honor for eliminating machine gun nests on their own that threatened engineers building a bridge. These men weren't engineers themselves, but their act saved engineers and enabled building the crossing, a beautiful example of cooperation and recognition of engineering work value. On the other hand, statistics from many campaigns showed that engineer battalions had high casualties, simply because where others could carefully take cover, an engineer had to go and do something. Blow something up, fix something, pull something out of the way. Each of these somethings could turn into a fatal moment, and yet they went into it again and again. Now we have an idea of how dramatic the key actions of engineers in defense and attack were. But what did their daily life look like when they weren't building bridges or clearing mines? What did they do between battles? How did they spend time in the rear, and what was it like to be that guy with a shovel when others were resting? In a moment, we'll peek behind the scenes of war engineers' lives and see that their work was far from over when they left the battlefield. The daily routine of engineers during World War II was a mixture of hard work, short moments of calm, and ever-present stress. Unlike frontline units that rotated between line and rear, engineers rarely had a real break. Their skills were needed constantly. Even in apparent calm, there was always something to do. As soon as battle quieted, cleanup of battlefield and repairs came. Engineers cleared destroyed equipment from roads, cleaned cities of debris, and ensured soldiers had ways to continue forward. In the rear, they built field kitchens, latrines, dug wells, or installed water tanks so men had something to drink and wash with. They often provided provisional electricity for field hospitals or headquarters using generators. As they said, if something worked in camp, somewhere was an unnoticed engineer who took care of it. Despite ever-present danger, engineers tried to lead normal military life and maintain morale. From letters home, we learn they complained about endless work, but we also find jokes and small joys in them. For example, Sergeant Frank Lambeau, an engineer from the 305th Battalion, described to his fiancée in letters from Europe how he and comrades drank coffee in trenches, laughed at their own mud-covered appearance, and sang songs from home loudly to drive away fear. In one letter, he describes how during a break in the Ardennes, they built a snow statue of a general in front of headquarters and entertained the whole company with it. A small joke that helped release tension before the next march. Engineers had strong camaraderie among themselves. This was also due to working in small teams where one relied on another literally for life and death. When 2 men together carry away a heavy mine or secretly mine a bridge together, a bond forms between them. Memories of many engineer veterans mention that their unit was like family. Maybe also because they felt other soldiers didn't completely understand them. After all, another engineer knew what it was like to crawl through a canal with explosives or freeze waist-deep in water while building a bridge. They nicknamed each other variously, sometimes with humor. American engineers called themselves ditch diggers or mud soldiers. Czech and Slovak engineers who fought, for example, at Dunkirk or on the Eastern Front, used the familiar boys from engineering. They weren't as visible, but all the more tight-knit. Food and sleep were often rare commodities for engineers. Imagine an entire unit getting an evening order. By morning, there must be a bridge here. While infantry can lie down for a few hours, engineers quickly throw down cold canned food and work all night on construction. In the morning, tanks and artillery roll across the bridge forward. Infantry marches on and engineers pack up tools, grab their things and run to catch up with their army. Tired, sleepless, some veterans remember falling asleep while walking. They were so exhausted. One British engineer described the Italian campaign in memoirs like this. Days blurred together. We either built roads or destroyed roads over and over. We slept in bulldozer cabs, ate cold beans from cans, and joked that we probably didn't even know what silence sounded like anymore because something was always booming or roaring around us. This description captures the everyday life of an engineer. Monotonous hard work interrupted by moments of chaos and deafening blasts when something exploded. When a quiet day in the rear finally came, engineers often weren't even bored. They unpacked and checked equipment to see if they had enough charges, complete tools, undamaged detonators. They repaired their special equipment, cleaned mine detectors of mud, oiled them, fixed torn pontoons, sharpened saws. Engineer commanders sometimes used relative calm for training, so soldiers practiced model situations instead of resting. How to build bridges faster, how to properly mark found mines, and similar tasks. Preparing materials was extremely important. For example, before a major operation, engineers got the task of preparing thousands of sandbags, cutting kilometers of barbed wire to required lengths, or assembling explosive packages for individual teams containing precisely specified types of charges for given tasks. This ant-like work had to be finished on time, otherwise what was needed would be missing in battle. Among other soldiers, engineers sometimes had a reputation as those who fix everything and were everywhere. It was said with a smile, "When something doesn't work, call the engineers." It was common that when, for example, a field kitchen ran out of fuel, an engineer was found who knew where to get a piece of pipe and make a replacement burner from it. Or when a gun needed to be moved and a road was missing, an engineer officer came and arranged an improvised footbridge over a ditch. This versatility aroused admiration. One American officer supposedly declared after the war, "Our engineers weren't polished engineers with diplomas. They were bearded guys with shovels who could build you a cathedral from planks and a few screws if you wanted." Certainly an exaggeration, but it captures well the engineer's ability to handle any challenge. Besides technical work, engineers couldn't avoid the bloody side of war. Many had to collect wounded and dead after battles, drag dead horse bodies from roads to clear highways. This left psychological scars on them. They weren't any less sensitive than other soldiers, and the awareness that their decisions were crucial. Where to put a mine, what strength charge to use, could cause death or save many people weighed on them. Psychologically demanding was also disabling unexploded ammunition. Imagine an engineer in bombed London. All around are broken houses, and buried in the ground is an unexploded aircraft bomb ticking. The bombing has stopped, but for this man, the fight doesn't end. Instead, a race against time begins. Dozens of engineer bomb specialists, so-called bomb disposal squads within Royal Engineers, died in Britain trying to disable these silent killers. Nearly 400 of them lost their lives in the war, counting other Allied countries too. And yet more and more stepped up to protect cities. One British sergeant who survived these nerve-wracking operations laconically stated, "I take every unexploded bomb as a personal duel. Either I win or it does." This shows something of the mentality of these unassuming heroes. In free moments, when any were found, engineers tried to live normally. They wrote letters home. Often, however, they couldn't reveal details about their work in them, so they described more general things to families. Censorship would have intervened otherwise. Many confided only after the war what they had been through. For example, in letters before Normandy, Engineers assured families at home they were just on exercises, and only after the landing could they write the truth. One British engineer officer, Major Rodney M., wrote to his mother in a letter just before the invasion that the men were in good spirits, joking and curious how everything they had planned so long would turn out. He admitted, however, that they would be quite busy for a few days and that the family shouldn't worry about him. His words radiate optimism and determination, typical for soldiers who believed in their preparedness. And that was exactly the spirit an engineer had to be imbued with to withstand that pressure. World War II ended in 1945, but for engineers, work was far from over. Millions of pieces of unexploded ammunition and extensive minefields remained scattered across battlefields from Europe through North Africa to Asia. And again, it was engineers who had to step up and make the world safer. In following months and years, engineer units from all armies diligently cleaned countries of war traps. For example, in evacuated areas of Ukraine and Belarus, Soviet sappers cleared enormous areas of mines. Many died in the process because hasty work with tired men brought tragic mistakes. Similarly, in Western Europe, Allied engineers collected and disabled hundreds of thousands of bombs and mines. In Denmark, German prisoners were even forced to clear minefields that the Wehrmacht had left there. Even these trained engineers died by hundreds from explosion effects in one of the dark chapters of the post-war period. To this day, some European forests and African deserts hide mines from World War II. And current bomb disposal experts, another generation of engineers, occasionally discover them. You might ask what legacy the engineers of the World War II generation left. Above all, they were quiet heroes who proved that victory cannot be achieved by weapon strength alone, but also by skill, diligence, and courage in the face of everyday danger. Their work may not always have been in newspaper headlines, but generals knew their worth. After the war, experience from engineer deployment began to be systematically studied and reflected in modern combat concepts. Today's armies consider engineer forces as important as tank or air forces. Even modern combat doctrine uses the terms mobility, counter-mobility, and survivability. Exactly the three pillars on which engineer work stood in the years 1939 to 1945. Also, many technologies and procedures were perfected based on wartime engineer experience. Mine detectors became more sensitive. Special mine-clearing tanks with plows or flails were created so soldiers didn't have to go into fields manually as before. Temporary bridges like Bailey type are used to this day worldwide during floods and crises. They assemble easily and can carry heavy vehicles. Plastic explosives experimented with in World War II became standard and are now safer and more effective. And what's more, engineers became universal helpers in peacetime too. Whenever you see the Army helping during natural disasters today, maybe building temporary footbridges after floods, clearing fallen trees, or disposing of unexploded bombs from war, these are usually members of engineer units, continuing the tradition of those brave sappers from World War II. Today, when we look back, we can say with respect that being an engineer during World War II meant being both a tireless worker and a brave person. It meant working quietly in the shadow of famous battles and yet being one of the key links in the chain leading to victory. Engineers overcame obstacles literally and figuratively. They broke down barriers before their armies and also broke down prejudices that wars are decided only by weapons. Their shovels, axes, wrenches, and detonating devices were often the difference between defeat and victory in critical moments. The next time you watch a World War II documentary and see columns of soldiers, tanks, and artillery rolling forward, remember those who built bridges ahead of time at night, repaired broken roads, or dismantled mines under thresholds. The engineers. Their stories aren't always as well known, but they're all the more inspiring. Thanks to them, we can learn about ingenuity, courage, and sacrifice that went hand in hand with combat deployment. Today's engineer soldiers, whether in the Czech army or elsewhere in the world, proudly continue the legacy of their predecessors. They use modern technologies, but the essence of their mission is the same: help others get through danger and handle any obstacle. And just like then, today it's still true that they often get thanked only when their work saves the situation. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked this video, please give it a like and share it so it reaches other history enthusiasts. I'd also appreciate your comments and opinions. Thanks again for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in another historical discussion.